What's up, folks? It's getting to be the middle end of August time frame right now, and my allergies happen to be in full swing, so if I sound a little nasally, that's why. But every year I know when my allergies kick in, it is some of the best and some of my favorite fishing the whole year. Kind of that mid to late August time frame all the way through September, I think is some of the best potential for good action of like giant fish on Fort Peck. So I'm going to give you a little update on what's going on, what has been going on, and a little look into the future. A lot of my fishing lately, what I'm going to be referencing, is fairly close to the dam. Close is relative at Fort Peck, I'd say within about 20 miles of the dam. So a lot of these patterns will apply throughout the lake, but keeping in mind a lot of the walleye, lake trout stuff that I'm referencing right now is within 20 miles of the dam. So, for starters, one thing I'd like to mention, clear up a little bit, whether it's related to, clients when I'm guiding or people that I talk to at the boat launches, etc. Fort Peck fishing, as a general rule, is extremely tough. And part of that reason, I'll explain here. If you look behind me, this is a picture. This is a copy of a painting from Matt Doyle. Look him up, mattdoylefineart.com. Awesome paintings, by the way, killer paintings. These walleye right here are feeding on a large school of shiners, small bait fish. That is a common scene on a lot of lakes, rivers, etc., all over the place throughout, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, Montana, many lakes. Sakakawea, chock full of emerald shiners. A lot of lakes, walleye will feed on perch, lots of like 2 to 4 inch perch. On Fort Peck, there is shiners, there is perch. That being said, especially with lower water over the last few years, there's less shiners and less perch. Also, the big fish out there really key in on Cisco. The Cisco on Fort Peck, yes, there is smaller ones. Like this time of year, there's a lot of them like this size. But a lot of those big fish are keying in on like 6 to 12 inch Cisco. When you got big fish eating 6 to 12 inch Cisco, they're not eating shiners on and off all day. They're eating big meals once or twice, or if they're really gluttonous, 3 times a day, or maybe they don't even eat for a couple of days. So that is one of the big factors on Fort Peck. You get big fish from eating those big greasy Cisco, but you're going to have to try to convince a fish to eat that probably isn't in the mood to eat, or if it did feed, it's got like a 12 inch Cisco that it's trying to swallow, and you're trying to force feed it something else. So as a general rule, there's a lot less feeding windows where you got walleye like this, chowing down on shiners, which is a very common scene on, say, like Sakakawea. Like, to put in perspective, Sakakawea, number one, I fish Sakakawea a lot. There is a million walleye in Sakakawea. They're easy to find. There's tons of them, and they bite. It is surprising at times how difficult they can be to catch for how many are out there. That being said, they're oftentimes feeding on lots of little emerald shiners, or even the smelt a lot of times aren't that big. So there's lots of repetitive, they'll be feeding actively for a period of time where they're eating little minnows, eating more little minnows. Like to eat the equivalent to one big Cisco, that might be 20, 30 little shiners. They're actively feeding for a period of time, and that might be going on throughout the day. Whereas, Fort Peck, if they're eating those big Cisco, all of a sudden they wake up for one part of the day, eat, and it's over. If you missed it, if your timing is wrong, you're going to be working really hard. So, like I said, that's something to really keep in mind. Fort Peck is tricky. There's a lot of interesting things going on out there, and ultimately I think Fort Peck really rewards those that work really hard and are really persistent more than anything. A lot of times, you don't got to get overly hung up on your exact bait selection, but it is important to have a couple of different options, probably a reaction style bait, and then something that you can work painfully slow. Maybe something that's drugged very slowly on the bottom, and then something that's very aggressive, maybe something you can work up over their heads, to give them a couple different looks to see if you can trip that trigger of those overfed fish that aren't feeding very often. But anyways, that's just a little overview. Whether it's walleye, smallmouth, pike, and even sometimes the lake trout get a little weird. Fort Peck fishing is on average pretty difficult. So keep that in mind, put things in perspective. You're usually not going to go out there and just crush numbers of fish. A lot of times capitalizing on a few flurries throughout the day is what it's all about. And it's important to be focused and to be ready for when those moments come. So let's talk about a few more specifics here. We'll start with lake trout. So the lake trout, they're deep right now. As a general rule, you're going to find a lot of your fish in 100 to 130 foot and deeper. The water in the lake is not super high right now. A lot of that means you're going to be pretty much in the channel or fishing the ledges directly adjacent to the main channel. Look for little high spots in the channel, points, ledges dropping off into the channel. Graph through those. Generally speaking, the fish are not super hard to find. That being said, sometimes they take a little bit of playing around with to get one to go. Once you get one to go, keep your lines, active and get right back down there, because a lot of times once you get one to go, you can get that school fired up a little bit and get a few more in quick succession. There's a lot of different things you can give them. It's pretty hard to beat just a swim bait this time of the year. My go-to is a 5-inch Sport Zonker McRubber swim bait on a 2-ounce Callan's Ultimate Jig. I'll also upsize all the way to a 6.5-inch McRubber. These are not even big at all. They eat Cisco this big and bigger all the time. Stuff like that. Another good big option is a Lunker City shaker. This is a 6-inch Lunker City shaker. This is a 2-ounce Callan's Ultimate S jig. These 2-ounce Callan's jigs are pretty good because the hooks, they're stout enough, but they're not overkill. A lot of bigger, heavier jigs, you end up with kind of like tarpon grade gauge hooks, and they just get so thick. They're kind of overkill, kind of hard on the lake trout. Personally, these Callan's jigs are actually pretty good for lake trout. But besides just the big swim baits, I'll fish something as small as a little 5/8 ounce Nishini Lure Works smelt head with a 3.5-inch Kitech Easy Shiner tail. And a lot of times I'll mix in tubes, spoons, hair jigs, etc. But a swim bait is really hard to beat. Generally speaking, especially this time of the year, you're making them chase. I tell people that I'm taking out to try to stay one step ahead of the fish. I think there's kind of a misconception that they always want the bait like super fast. Sometimes they want it super fast, but I'd say stay one step ahead of the fish. If the fish is moving very slowly, like I said, this whole thing, you really need electronics. You're watching them on your 2D, whatever you got. You want to stay one step ahead. That might mean that you're going like super fast with a high-speed gear ratio to stay one step ahead, and then they close the gap and finish the deal. Or it might mean that you're just crawling it. You might get a giant that latches on, closes the gap when you're just staying one step ahead. Okay, so I ran out of space in my SD card. Anyways, I was saying the key with the lake trout, most of the time this time of the year, you have to bring them up and make them chase high up into the water column. Generally, you want to stay one step ahead of them in terms of the speed that they're chasing you at. Something to keep in mind this time of year, with the warmer water and the really deep water you're catching them in, contrary to popular belief, they actually do get a little bit of barotrauma. They get some extra air in their air bladder. It's important to be extra careful with them. Don't be beating them up in the boat. Handle those fish well. If it's better to have a big net that you can like let them swim around in while you unhook them, pull them up for a quick picture, or just let them go or whatever. But pull them up for a quick picture, get them back, hold them for a sec. This time of year, make sure you hold them for a sec. Make sure they get their equilibrium for a sec and start kicking back down on their own. It's important to handle them well, to respect the resource, let those big fish go. Now, when it comes to walleye, trying to think of where I want to start here. So, generally speaking, as of late, the bite is fairly deep. Throughout July, all the way up until the end of July, there was quite a few shallow fish that I was finding, especially the eater-sized fish, but also big fish. By shallow, I'm talking like 8 to 20 foot. I'd say on average, most of the eater-sized fish I was looking for were especially that 8 to 20 foot range, with big fish mixed into that 8 to 20 foot range, but they seem to kind of be progressively moving deeper, those bigger fish. Lately, I would say most of the eater-sized fish I'm running into are also kind of that you know, 20-foot and deeper range as well. I'd say when I'm targeting eater size fish, that 18 to 24-foot range has been pretty prime. For big fish, 20-foot and deeper has been prime. I'm sure there's plenty of good shallow bites. There's lots of good weed lines. You know, I have not personally been looking shallow. I've been trending pretty deep. Back in July, almost all the structure that I was fishing was points connected to shore. They're primary points that come out and dump off into the main river channel, but a lot of them had shoreline not too terribly far away, or at least they were connected by, you know, the point to the shoreline in most situations. As time has gone on, you know, late July especially through all of August, though a lot of points and stuff have deep humps kind of out away from them that are, you know, they're kind of broken. There's that separation between, you know, they're out in the abyss. There's no connection to shore. And those deep humps have really been heating up, you know, especially those humps that might top off, you know, kind of that 20 to 25 foot of water range and then break off into really deep water. A lot of the tricky thing this time of year when it comes to graphing is to keep in mind, because ultimately one of my strategies on Fort Peck is to run through a lot of spots. Even if you are graphing fish and they don't eat, you can't take it too personally. You just got to keep popping along. The tricky thing this time of year is you got so many fish deep: smallmouth, walleye, pike, carp, catfish. It can be hard to discern. Generally speaking, a lot of the smallmouth are going to gravitate towards your high spots on, say, a hump. So if it tops off in 22 foot of water, a lot of times those smallmouth will congregate towards the top, where your walleye might congregate more on the break. The tricky thing is a lot of these breaks have a lot of rubble on them, so the smallmouth will congregate around there. So it can be tricky to discern what's what. As a general rule, if you're looking to target big walleye on Fort Peck, a lot of times I'm not necessarily looking for big groups of fish. A lot of times it might be 2 or 3 fish just kind of right on the, you know, right as it goes to break off towards the channel. You know, right now, like I said, you might have a hump that tops off in 22 and maybe it starts to break and, you know, that 26, 28 foot of water range, and you get a couple of marks right there. As you graph back and forth, you might see a couple of pods of a couple of fish. That's a good spot to stop on if you want to target some big fish. When it comes to numbers of fish, you're going to be looking for more of them. Plain and simple as that. They're not going to mark as big. A lot of the spots where you mark a lot more walleye, I feel like it tends to be smaller fish. That being said, a lot of times there is big fish around those small fish, but they might be offset from them just a little bit. Kind of hard to explain, but it's like you'll get a school of big, you know, of more eater-sized fish, and it's not that the big fish won't be in that area, but a lot of times they're not mixed in directly with the eater-sized fish, but they're in that area just offset from them a little bit. So sometimes good number spots have big fish around, but a lot of times, like I said, when I'm targeting big fish, it's very small pods of fish. Now when it comes to targeting these fish, whether it's eater-sized fish or bigger fish, eater-sized fish, I definitely like slow death rigs. Also, something I've been doing is casting these Walleye Nation Creation death jigs. This is a 3/4 ounce. And you'll run a crawler on this, pinch it off, and it's like a slow death behind a jig. You know, really I could probably be casting like a slow death style rig, and I think I'll probably try that in the future too. But these slow death jigs have been kind of fun to play around with, because there's a lot of situations on Fort Peck that don't set up as well for trolling like cranks and stuff, just because of the odd shapes of the structures. Trolling spinners, trolling bottom bouncers can work really well, but for me, a lot of times when I'm targeting smaller pods of fish and whatnot, casting is much more efficient. So I've been experimenting with casting slow death jigs. Like I said, so far so good. Been getting good action from small fish and lots of fish over 25 inches as well. Like I said, I like a 2-prong approach when targeting fish, and so like a slow death and a crawler a lot of times is my slower approach, and reaction baits, like, you know, whatever you want to call them, your jigging wraps, your glide style baits, is another go-to of mine. When it comes to the glide baits, I also really like darter heads with soft plastic minnow bodies, but I use them a little less so in the really deep water. But it's kind of a similar category of bait. Something to keep in mind, especially with this warmer water. With warmer water, the density of the water changes. The density of the water changes throughout the temperature range. The interesting thing to keep in mind is it will affect the action of your baits. So keep in mind day in, day out, if you have a favorite glide bait, it might be important to mix in a different variety glide bait. They all have different glides, drop rates. You know, a lot of them have different belly rolls, whether it's jigging wraps, flat jigs, you know, Acme Hyper Rattles, Johnny Darters, Shiver Minnows, etc. They all have a time and a place. And a lot of times, what I might recommend doing is just take a look at how they look over the side of the boat as you jig them. It might be surprising to you how the action varies throughout different temperature ranges. In this hotter water, baits can be less glidey than they would be in slightly colder water. Just keep that in mind and tinker around with your baits. You might notice a trend or a certain bait that picks up in this warmer water. Yeah, so kind of been rambling here. Trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to add. Like I said, I think the big thing when it comes to walleye fishing, bass fishing, etc., is not to get too hung up on particular spots. If they're not biting, say just leave them and head to the next spot. Cover a lot of water, stay on the move. I think it's important to fish fast, but you need to fish your spots thoroughly. A lot of times I'm targeting specific pieces of structure, rutting patterns. So day to day the pattern might even adjust a little bit too. You might notice fish trending shallower, trending deeper, trending towards certain points. Maybe they're trending towards humps. You know, it could change on a daily basis. Maybe a lot of your big fish all of a sudden want to move a little shallower, a little bit deeper. It's important to pay attention to those trends. As you start noticing fish using certain structures, certain things, look for similar structures as you work your way down the lake. Keep a move along. You know, have a reaction style bait, something slow, and just stick with it. Like I said, it can be very tricky fishing on Fort Peck. That being said, for those that work hard and stay persistent, it can be some of the most epic big fish fishing out there.